Picture a town where nobody bothers to lock their front door. That was Tewksbury, Massachusetts in 1969. It was the kind of place where you felt safe letting your kid walk home alone in the dark. But that innocence died on September 27th. That's the night 15-year-old John McCabe left a Knights of Columbus Gants and just vanished into the cool autumn air. He didn't run away. He didn't get lost. He was taken. For more than 4 decades, this case didn't just go cold, it froze solid. The police were stumped. The town whispered about drug gangs or hardened hitmen because the violence was so extreme, so personal. They assumed a monster had passed through town and moved on. But they were looking in the wrong direction. The answer wasn't in the criminal underworld. It was right under their noses, protected by a terrifying vow of silence. 3 teenagers made a pact to take the secret to their graves, and they almost did. They kept their mouths shut for 42 years. It wasn't DNA that finally caught them. It was the weight of a guilty conscience finally snapping. Stop for a second. I want you to forget the police reports. Forget the chalk outline I just told you about. Forget the trial, the lawyers, and the black and white photos of a crime scene that looks like it belongs in a horror movie. When we talk about cold cases, we have a bad habit of turning people into puzzles. We strip away their humanity and replace it with evidence markers. We treat them like a math problem that needs solving. But John McCabe wasn't a math problem. He was a 15-year-old boy. To understand why this crime broke the heart of an entire town, you have to understand who John was, and more importantly, you have to understand the world he lived in. It's hard for us to picture it now. If you look at Tewksbury, Massachusetts today, you see a busy suburb. But go back to 1969. It was different. It was the kind of place where the biggest noise on a Friday night was the sound of crickets or a car backfiring 3 streets over. It was a tight community. Everyone knew everyone. It was the era of unlocked doors and neighbors who actually watched out for each other's kids. John fit into this world perfectly. He wasn't a troublemaker. In every interview, in every recollection from the people who knew him, the same phrase keeps coming up. He was a good kid. Now, I know what you're thinking. People always say that about victims. It's almost a reflex. But with John, it seems to be the genuine, unvarnished truth. He came from a close-knit family, the kind of family that ate dinner together and knew where their kids were. He was navigating that awkward electric time between being a child and being a man. Think back to when you were 15. It's a strange age, isn't it? You're old enough to want independence, but you're still young enough to need permission. You're old enough to have a crush, to feel the sting of jealousy or the thrill of a Friday night out, but you're still young enough to catch frogs in a creek if the mood strikes you. That was John. He was standing right on that threshold. He had his whole life lined up in front of him like a runway. He had plans. He had momentum. He was just a regular teenager trying to figure out his place in the pecking order of high school. And this is where the story gets hard to tell. Because to understand John's death, we have to look at his parents, Evelyn and William. They are the emotional center of this tragedy. Evelyn McCabe, John's mother, carried a burden for 40 years that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. It wasn't just grief. It was a specific, agonizing kind of regret that eats you alive. There's a quote from her that haunts me. It's about that night, September 27th. Apparently, there was a question of whether John should go to the dance at all. You know how it is with parents and teenagers. There's always a negotiation. Can I go? Who's going to be there? What time will you be home? Evelyn looked at her son, her good kid, and she made a choice. She said, "I couldn't punish him for nothing, so I let him go to the dance." Read that again. I couldn't punish him for nothing. She was being a good mother. She was being fair. She looked at her son, saw that he hadn't done anything wrong, and decided he deserved a night of fun. She gave him permission to be happy. And for the next 4 decades, she had to live with the fact that her kindness, her fairness, was the unlocking mechanism for his murder. If she had been unfair, if she had grounded him for no reason, if she had been strict and irrational, John might still be alive today. He'd be in his 60s. Maybe he'd have grandkids. That is the cruelty of this case. It punishes the good. It took a mother's love and turned it into a weapon against her. Every time she looked at an empty chair at the dinner table, she had to remember that she was the one who said yes. That is a heavy thing to carry. It's the kind of weight that crushes families. But the McCabes didn't break. They just kept waiting. They kept loving the memory of the boy who walked out the door that night and never came back. Then there's the what if of Carol Coffey. Carol was a friend of John's. In a different timeline, in a fairer world, she would have been the headline to this story, but not as a victim, as his date. She was supposed to go with him that night to the Knights of Columbus dance. Imagine how that changes the dynamic. If they are together, maybe they walk together. Maybe they get a ride from her parents. Maybe the killers, seeing 2 people instead of 1, decide to keep driving. But Carol's mother said no. She made Carol stay home. Fate is a funny, terrible thing. Carol stayed home and lived. John got permission to go and died. It's these tiny, microscopic decisions, a mother saying yes, a mother saying no, but determined who survived 1969 and who didn't. John ended up going to that dance solo. He walked into that hall alone.
Let's talk about that dance. The Knights of Columbus, KFC. If you grew up in a Catholic town in the Northeast, you know exactly what this room looked like. Wood paneling, streamers, the smell of cheap cologne and floor wax, music blasting too loud. This was the social arena for a teenager in Tewksbury. It was where you went to see and be seen. It was innocent fun. Or at least it was supposed to be. John went there to have a good time. He wasn't looking for a fight. He wasn't looking for drugs. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was just a kid trying to talk to girls. And that right there is the tragedy of the motive. We found out later, 40 years later, that John's crime was talking. Just talking. There was a girl there, Marla. She was young, maybe 13 or so. John knew her. He spoke to her. Maybe he flirted, maybe he just said hello. We don't know the exact words, but we know that in the twisted, violent minds of the boys watching him, this was a capital offense. There were other teenagers there that night, older boys. Walter Shelley, who was 18. He had a car, a maroon Chevy. In 1969, having a car and being 18 made you a king. You had power. You had mobility. Shelley felt he had a claim on Marla. He saw John McCabe, this 15-year-old kid, talking to his girl, and a switch flipped. It wasn't a rational anger. It was a primal, territorial rage. It was the kind of toxic jealousy that usually ends in a shoved shoulder or a punch in the nose in the parking lot. You expect the black eye. You expect a bruised ego. You don't expect murder. But that's what was brewing in the corners of that dance hall. While John was laughing, while he was listening to the music, eyes were watching him. Dark eyes. Eyes that didn't see a human being, but a problem that needed to be taught a lesson.
When the dance ended, the night took a turn that still feels impossible to reconcile. John needed to get home. In 1969, hitchhiking wasn't a death wish. It was a mode of transportation. It was common. You stuck your thumb out, a neighbor picked you up, and you saved yourself the walk. It was a high-trust society. John walked out of that hall, into the cool night air, probably replaying the night's events in his head. Maybe he was smiling. He started walking. He started hitching. He had no idea that the maroon Chevy was prowling the streets. He had no idea that the good kid label wasn't going to save him. He had no idea that the simple act of chatting with a girl had signed his death warrant. I want you to really sit with the image of him on that road. He's alone. It's dark. He's trusting the world to treat him fairly. He's trusting that the rules of society, the rules his parents taught him, are in effect. He believes that if you're good, good things happen to you, or at least bad things don't happen. He was wrong. The gap between who John McCabe was and how he died is too wide to measure. He was gentle. His death was violent. He was loud and full of life. He died bound and gagged in silence. He was surrounded by friends. He died alone in a dirt lot. The loss here isn't just a body, it's the potential. When they killed John McCabe, they didn't just stop a heart from beating. They stole 40 years of life. They stole the man he would have become. They stole the comfort of his parents' old age. They stole the innocence of Tewksbury. After that night, nobody left their doors unlocked anymore. After that night, you didn't let your kid walk home alone. The town changed because the crime was so senseless. If it had been a robbery, people could understand it. If it had been a gang war, people could rationalize it. But this, a boy killed for talking? A boy killed because a bully with the Chevy got jealous. It was too chaotic. It meant that nobody was safe. So when we talk about the victim in this story, don't just picture a grainy black and white photo in a newspaper. Picture the 15-year-old boy with his thumb out on the side of the road, waiting for a ride home that would never come. Picture his mother, Evelyn, waiting up for him, watching the clock tick past midnight, the silence in the house growing louder and heavier with every passing second.
She let him go because she couldn't punish him for nothing. And for 40 years, she was the one who took the punishment. That's who John McCabe was. He was the boy who should have made it home. And the fact that he didn't is a stain that never really washed out of that town, no matter how much time passed. We need to hold on to that. Because what happens next, the investigation, the silence, the secrets, it only matters because John mattered. We can't let the mystery overshadow the boy. He is the reason we are here. He is the reason we have to find out the truth. September 27th, 1969, Saturday. I want you to put yourself in that specific moment in time. The summer of '69 was over. Woodstock had just happened a month earlier, shifting the culture of the country. But up here in the Merrimack Valley in Massachusetts, things moved a little slower. The leaves were just starting to turn that burnt orange and crisp yellow. The air had that bite to it, the kind that tells you football season is here and winter is coming. It was a perfect, quintessential New England autumn weekend. For 15-year-old John McCabe, this Saturday wasn't about history or culture shifts. It was about the Knights of Columbus. The KFC Hall in Tewksbury was the center of the universe that night. If you were a teenager in town, that's where you were. Try to imagine the noise inside that room. It wouldn't be the polished digital sound we have today. It would be raw, booming off the wood paneling and the linoleum floors. A live band or a DJ spinning 45s, playing the hits that are now classic rock, but were then just the top of the charts. The room would have been hot, smelling of cheap perfume, hairspray, floor wax, and teenage sweat. John was there, right in the middle of it. Witnesses, kids he went to school with, neighbors, saw him. He wasn't hiding in a corner. He was drinking a soda, laughing, moving through the crowd. He was wearing an olive green shirt and corduroy pants, looking every bit the standard American teenager. He looked happy. He looked safe. There were chaperones, of course.
There were adults around. It felt like a sanctioned, protected bubble where nothing bad could possibly happen. But the clock was ticking. Every song that played was counting down the minutes to the end of his life. When the dance wound down, the bubble popped. The lights came up, the music stopped, and the doors swung open to let the cool night air rush in. It was time to go home. Now, this is the part that's hard for us to wrap our heads around today. In 2025, if your kid is at a dance, you're waiting in the parking lot with the engine running, or you're tracking their Uber on your phone. But in 1969, the world operated on a different frequency of trust. John didn't have a ride, and he didn't seem worried about it. He did what thousands of kids did every weekend back then. He started walking, intending to hitchhike. I need you to understand that hitchhiking wasn't viewed as a death wish then. It was a social utility. It was community transit. You stuck your thumb out, a neighbor or a local dad driving home from the bar would pull over, you'd hop in, make small talk about the Red Sox, and get dropped off at your driveway. It was practically a civic duty to pick up a kid walking in the cold. So John walked out of the Knights of Columbus Hall. He walked toward the road. Witnesses saw him head out. He was probably replaying the night in his head. Maybe thinking about that girl he talked to. Maybe thinking about a joke a friend told him. He stepped onto the shoulder of the road, into the darkness, and stuck out his thumb. That is the last time anyone who loved him saw him alive. What happened next is a gap in the timeline that lasted for hours. But for his parents, Evelyn and William, it must have felt like a century. Picture the McCabe house that night. At first, it's just annoyance. It's 11 p.m. and he's not home. You look at the clock. You sigh. You think, he's pushing his curfew. He's going to get a talking to when he walks through that door.
Then it's midnight. The annoyance starts to curdle into worry. You turn off the TV. You sit in the kitchen. The house is too quiet. Every car that drives down the street sounds like it might be him, so you perk up, listening for the tires to slow down, listening for the car door to slam. But the car just keeps driving, fading into the distance. Then it's 1 a.m. Now the worry is panic. You start making phone calls. You call the friend's parents. Is John there? Did he leave with you? The answers are all the same. No, Mrs. McCabe, we saw him leave. He was hitching. By 2 a.m., the silence in that house must have been deafening. You know that feeling in the pit of your stomach when you can't reach someone you love? Multiply that by 1,000. There were no cell phones to ping, no GPS to track. He was just gone. The world had swallowed him whole. Evelyn and William McCabe stared at the door, willing it to open. They probably bargained with God. Just let him walk in and I won't even yell at him. Just let him be safe. But the door stayed closed. Sunday morning broke, September 28th. While the McCabes were living through their own personal hell, the rest of the world was waking up. The sun was shining. It was another beautiful fall day. Over in the city of Lowell, just a town over from Tewksbury, 2 young kids were heading out to play. They weren't thinking about missing teenagers. They were thinking about frogs. There was a vacant lot off Maple Street in Lowell. To an adult, a vacant lot is an eyesore. It's weeds, dirt, broken glass, and trash. But to a kid, it's an adventure. It's a kingdom. These 2 children cut through the lot, pushing through the tall grass and the brush, looking for a wet spot to catch some frogs. They didn't find frogs.
They saw something lying in the dirt. At first glance, your brain tries to make sense of it. Is it a pile of old clothes? Is it a mannequin dumped by a department store? Is it a drunk who passed out? They got closer, and the reality of what they were looking at shattered their childhood right then and there. It was John. He was lying face down in the grit. He was fully clothed, still wearing that olive green shirt and those corduroy pants from the dance. But he wasn't sleeping. The condition of the body told a story of absolute terror. This wasn't a quick robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a fight that got out of hand where someone threw a lucky punch. This was torture. His eyes were taped shut. Think about the cruelty of that. The killers wanted him in total darkness. They wanted his last sensory experience to be the sound of their voices and the feeling of the dirt, but no sight. His mouth was taped shut. He couldn't scream. He couldn't beg. He couldn't say goodbye. But the most horrific detail, the one that made seasoned police officers recoil, was the rope. John was bound with a complexity that suggested pure malice. They hadn't just tied his hands, they had tied a rope around his ankles, pulled his legs up behind him, and tied the other end of that rope around his neck. I want you to visualize the mechanics of that, because it matters. It's a position sometimes called hog tying, but this was more sinister. In this position, if you struggle, if you try to kick your legs out to free yourself, you pull the rope tighter around your own throat. If you try to relax your legs to stop the choking, the tension shifts and you can't breathe. It was a trap made of his own body. Every survival instinct he had, to kick, to fight, to move, was weaponized against him. He had spent his final moments alone in that vacant lot, blind and mute, fighting a losing battle against gravity and a piece of rope. The two children who found him ran. I can only imagine how fast they ran. They got the police.
When the Lowell police arrived, the scene became a flurry of activity. Flashbulbs popping, men in suits stepping carefully through the weeds, the coroner arriving. They cordoned off the lot. The neighbors came out on their porches, arms crossed, whispering, watching the tragedy unfold from a safe distance. They identified him. They had to make that call to Tewksbury. They had to tell William and Evelyn that the waiting was over, but the nightmare had just begun. They processed the scene for hours. They took photos that would be shown in a courtroom 40 years later. They collected the rope. They collected the tape. They looked for footprints, tire tracks, anything that could tell them who did this. Eventually, they moved the body. They lifted John McCabe out of the dirt and placed him in the back of a wagon. And when they left, all that remained in that vacant lot off Maple Street was a chalk outline, a jagged white line drawn in the dirt, tracing the shape of a 15-year-old boy who had gone to a dance to have fun. The rain would eventually wash that chalk away. The weeds would grow back. The seasons would change. But the image of that boy, bound, gagged, and discarded like trash, would sear itself into the memory of the town. The timeline of the last day ended there, in the dirt. The clock had stopped for John, but for the detectives and for the family, a new clock had just started ticking. It was the clock of the investigation, and nobody standing there in that lot on that Sunday morning could have possibly guessed that the clock would tick for 41 years before the alarm finally went off. The brutality of the scene suggested a monster, a maniac, someone devoid of human feeling. The police looked at that rope, at that tape, and they thought, "We are looking for a psychopath." They were right about the psychopath part, but they were wrong about where to look. They started looking for strangers. They started looking for gangs.
They didn't realize yet that the people who did this weren't drifting serial killers passing through town. They were boys who had probably sat in the same classrooms as John. They were boys who drove the streets of Tewksbury. They were boys who perhaps went home that night, ate breakfast with their parents, and went to sleep in their own beds, while John lay dying in the cold. That Sunday morning, the mystery was born. The who and the why took over. The grief was heavy, but the confusion was heavier. How does a kid go from a church dance to a vacant lot in 12 hours? How does a life get extinguished so fast? As the sun set on Sunday, September 28, 1969, John McCabe was in the morgue. His parents were in shock, and 3 teenagers were somewhere in town making a pact that would hold for a lifetime. The last day was over. The long night had begun. You have to understand what a detective sees when he looks at a dead body. Most of the time, murder is messy, impulsive, and stupid. It's a drunken argument that goes too far. It's a husband losing his temper. It's a robbery where the kid panics and pulls the trigger. Usually, the crime scene tells you exactly what happened because the killer didn't have a plan. They just reacted. But when the Lowell police looked at John McCabe lying in that vacant lot, they didn't see stupid. They didn't see impulsive. They saw something that looked terrifyingly like a plan. This is where the investigation went off the rails before it even really started. You can't blame the cops for thinking the way they did. It was 1969. The world was getting sharper, darker edges. The Manson family murders had happened just weeks before in California. The Zodiac killer was terrorizing the West Coast. The idea of the random thrill kill or the ritualistic murder was seeping into the American water supply. People were scared. They were ready to believe in monsters. And the scene in that lot screamed monster. Think about the rope. I keep coming back to the rope because the detectives kept coming back to it. You don't accidentally tie a boy's ankles to his neck. That takes time. That takes effort. It takes a specific kind of cruelty. If 2 high school kids get into a fist fight over a girl, one of them might get a black eye or a broken nose. Maybe, in the absolute worst-case scenario, someone falls and hits their head on a curb.
But you don't bind someone with 50 feet of clothesline in the middle of a fight. So the police looked at this evidence and they made a logical leap. They thought, this isn't a couple of teenagers, this is a hit. The brutality suggested a gang. It suggested organized crime. Lowell was a gritty city. It had a tough reputation. There were rumors of motorcycle gangs, of drug dealers pushing into the area. The theory that took hold, the one that would blind investigators for decades, was that John McCabe had stumbled into something he wasn't supposed to see. The narrative went like this. Maybe John saw a drug deal. Maybe he was mistaken for someone else. Maybe he was picked up by a crew of hardened criminals who wanted to send a message to the town. It made sense. The tape over the eyes? That's execution style. The binding? That's how you make sure the body stays where you put it. It absolved the town, in a way. If the killers were a roving gang of drug dealers from the city, then the neighbors were still safe. It meant the evil was an outsider. It meant the suburbs were still innocent, just unlucky. Detectives chased this ghost for years. They interviewed tough guys in bars. They harassed local lowlifes. They looked for connections to organized crime families in Boston. They spent thousands of man-hours trying to find a phantom gang that didn't exist. Every time they got a tip about a suspicious car or a guy with a record, they ran it down, hoping this was the break. But every lead turned to ash, because while they were looking for professional killers, the real killers were sitting in high school algebra class. Let's talk about the physical evidence for a minute. You watch CSI or Law & Order today and you think, how did they miss this? It's so obvious. You assume that if there's a rope, there's DNA. If there's tape, there are fingerprints. But you have to reset your brain to 1969 technology. DNA profiling didn't exist. It wasn't even a sci-fi dream yet. Alec Jeffreys wouldn't invent DNA fingerprinting until the mid-1980s. So, the skin cells the killers left on John's clothes? Invisible. The sweat on the rope? Useless. The saliva on the tape? Just spit.
The police did have fingerprint technology, of course, but getting a clean print off the sticky side of adhesive tape that's been out in a dirt lot all night, that's a nightmare. It's not like lifting a print off a clean wine glass. The adhesive distorts the ridges. The dirt messes up the contrast. They tried, they dusted, they looked, but the magic bullet wasn't there. They had the rope, they analyzed the weave, they analyzed the knot. It was a specific type of knot, something you might learn in the military or the Boy Scouts. They thought, okay, maybe the killer is a veteran. Another red herring, another path leading away from 3 teenagers in a Chevy. And speaking of the Chevy, the car was the other massive blind spot. Witnesses saw John hitchhiking, so naturally the police were looking for a car. They set up roadblocks, they stopped drivers, they asked, "Did you see a boy on the road?" But here's the problem with eyewitness testimony. It's terrible. Someone says they saw a dark car. Well, in 1969, half the cars on the road were dark sedans. Someone else says they saw a muscle car. Someone else says it was a truck. The police were drowning in bad data. They were looking for a suspect vehicle. They weren't looking for a car that belonged to a local kid. They weren't looking for Walter Shelley's maroon Chevy because Walter Shelley was just a neighbor. He was just a guy from the area. He didn't fit the profile of the gangland assassin they had built in their heads. This is the tragedy of the profile. Once you decide you're looking for a monster, you stop looking at the humans.
The most frustrating part? The police actually spoke to the killers. This is the detail that keeps me up at night. In the weeks after the murder, the police cast a wide net. They interviewed dozens of teenagers. They spoke to Michael Ferreira. They spoke to Walter Shelley. They spoke to Edward Brown. They were on the list. Their names were typed onto index cards in the police file. But remember that vow of silence? These 3 guys stuck to the script. I didn't see anything. I was somewhere else. I don't know what happened. And because they were young, and because they didn't look like the hardened drug dealers the police were hunting, they were cleared. They slipped through the net. The detectives marked "no info" next to their names and moved on to the next lead, looking for the imaginary gang. If just one cop had pushed a little harder, if just one alibi had been checked a little more thoroughly, but they didn't. They moved on. And then the worst thing that can happen to a murder case happened. Time passed. It didn't happen all at once. It happens in slow motion. The first few months are a frenzy. The phone is ringing off the hook. The papers are running headlines every day. The family has hope. Then the months turn into a year. The phone stops ringing. The headlines move to the back page, then to no page at all. The detectives who work the scene catch a new case, a fresh body, a warm trail, and they have to prioritize that. The John McCabe file gets moved from the active desk to the filing cabinet. Then it's 1970, then 1972. The detectives start to retire. The men who saw John in the dirt, the men who felt that visceral anger and need to solve it, they turn in their badges. They go fishing. They move to Florida. New detectives come in. To them, John McCabe isn't a boy they saw. He's just a stack of paper in a box. He's a cold case.
He looked his neighbors in the eye. He looked John's parents in the eye. And he said nothing. The years turned into decades. The 1980s came and went. The 1990s. The chalk outline had long since washed away. The vacant lot probably got built over or grew into a tangle of woods. The physical traces of John McCabe were gone. To the town of Tewksbury, John became a legend, a ghost story. The details got fuzzy. Remember that kid who got killed in the 60s? Yeah, something about a drug deal, right? The lie the police had accidentally started became the accepted truth. The gang theory hardened into fact in the public imagination. By the year 2000, 30 years had passed. Most cases that are 30 years old stay unsolved forever. The evidence is degraded,
The witnesses are dead. The memories are faded. The statistical likelihood of solving a murder drops off a cliff after the first 48 hours. After 48 years, it's basically zero. The file was gathering dust in a basement storage room. The rope was sitting in an evidence bag, brittle and old. The tape was dried out. But technology was catching up. The world of 1969 was dead. The world of the 21st century was here. And with it came new tools. We weren't looking at fingerprints with a magnifying glass anymore. We were looking at the building blocks of life. And something else was happening too. The cold case movement was starting. Police departments realized they had thousands of unsolved murders sitting in boxes, and they suddenly had the science to crack them. Grants were written, special units were formed. In Lowell, a new team took a look at the old boxes. They weren't the original detectives. They didn't have the tunnel vision about the gang theory. They looked at the file with fresh eyes. They saw the rope, they saw the tape, they saw the names on the index cards, the teenagers who were interviewed and released. And they saw something the original detectives missed. Or rather, they saw what was missing. The story didn't add up. The gang theory had no evidence. It was all smoke. So if it wasn't a gang, who was it?
They turned their attention back to the locals, back to the kids who were at the dance, back to the maroon Chevy. The parents, William and Evelyn, were old now. They were tired. They had spent a lifetime waiting. They probably thought they would die without knowing the truth. They had made their peace with the fact that justice was a concept for the next life, not this one. But the police were about to knock on their door again. The red herrings had finally swum away. The fog was lifting, and the truth, the ugly, banal, heartbreaking truth, was about to be dug up from the silence where it had been buried for half a century. The long, cold night was ending. The spark was about to be lit. You know the scariest thing about a monster? It's not when they look like a monster. If a guy comes at you wearing a hockey mask and wielding a chainsaw, you know to run. That's easy. That's survival instinct. The scariest monster is the one who smiles at you, the one who waves to you from his driveway, the one who bags your groceries or sits 2 pews behind you at church. While the Lowell police were tearing the city apart looking for a shadowy syndicate of drug dealers, the real killers were doing exactly what John McCabe was doing. They were just living their lives. They weren't hitmen flown in from Chicago. They were teenagers. They were local boys who walked the same hallways, ate at the same diners, and breathed the same air as the boy they killed. Let's look at the lineup. It's terrifyingly mundane. First, you had Walter Shelley. He was 18 years old in 1969. In the hierarchy of teenage life, he was near the top because he had wheels. He drove a maroon 1965 Chevy Impala. You know the car. It's a classic now, but back then, it was just a cool ride. It was freedom. It was the kind of car you'd pile into on a Friday night to cruise the main drag. That car is important. Witnesses saw a car just like it near the crime scene. But because Walter was just Walter from down the street, nobody put 2 and 2 together. He didn't fit the profile of a gangland assassin, so he became invisible.
Then you had Michael Ferreira and Edward Brown. They were younger, part of that same circle. These weren't career criminals with rap sheets a mile long. They were kids. But on that Saturday night, after they left John McCabe bound and dying in the dirt, they stopped being kids. They entered a brotherhood of blood. This is where the story turns into a psychological thriller. You have to wonder what went through their heads the next morning. They wake up, the sun is shining, they hear the sirens, they hear the town talking. Did you hear about the McCabe kid? They found him. Panic must have set in. Absolute heart-hammering panic.
According to what we learned much later, they didn't just cross their fingers and hope for the best. They managed the risk. They made a pact, a vow of silence. It wasn't just a pinky promise. It was enforced by fear. Michael Ferreira, who wasn't even a legal adult yet, allegedly looked the others in the eye and threatened to kill anyone who opened their mouth. Think about the weight of that. You're 16, 17 years old, and your friend tells you, if you talk, you're next. You believe him. You saw what happened to John. You know what they are capable of. So they locked the secret away. They buried it deep. And then they did the hardest thing imaginable. They stayed. Usually when people commit a crime this horrific, they run. They move to Florida. They join the Merchant Marines. They get as far away from the scene of the crime as possible. But these three, they stayed in Tewksbury. They stayed in the blast radius. They grew up. That's the part that makes you sick. They got to do all the things John McCabe never did. They finished high school. They got jobs. They got married. They had children. They went to barbecues. They complained about taxes. They watched the Red Sox win the World Series.
Every single day for 41 years, they woke up knowing what they did. Imagine the compartmentalization that takes. You have to split your brain in half. On one side is the normal guy who cuts his grass on Sundays. On the other side is the killer who tied a rope around a boy's neck. And you have to make sure the wall between those two sides never cracks. Not when you've had too many beers, not when you're fighting with your wife, not when you're lying in bed at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling. For 41 years, the wall held. The cruelty of their silence is impossible to overstate. They didn't just hide, they watched. They watched John's parent, Evelyn and William, age. They saw them on the local news holding up photos of John, pleading for answers. Walter Shelley could have been sitting in his living room, eating dinner, watching Evelyn McCabe cry on his television screen, and he just kept eating. He knew the answer she was begging for. He had it in his pocket, but he kept it there. They were neighbors. In a town the size of Tewksbury, their paths must have crossed. It's statistically probable that at some point in 4 decades, one of the killers stood in line at the pharmacy or the post office with a member of the McCabe family. Maybe they held a door open for them. Maybe they nodded hello. That is the bomb under the table. Alfred Hitchcock had this theory about suspense. He said if a bomb goes off under a table, the audience gets a shock. But if you show the audience the bomb under the table first, and then show the people sitting there talking about baseball, unaware that they are about to die, that is suspense. That is torture. For us, looking back at this story, we see the bomb. We see Shelley, Ferreira, and Brown living their lives, breathing the free air, while the ghost of John McCabe stands right behind them. But for the town of Tewksbury, for the police, and for the family, there was no bomb. There were just 3 regular guys, getting older, getting grayer, blending into the background. They were the ultimate red herring because they looked so terrifyingly normal.
The police were out there looking for Scarface, and the killers were the guys next door. They proved that you don't need to be a mastermind to get away with murder. You just need to keep your mouth shut. You just need to count on the fact that people don't want to believe their neighbors are monsters. But secrets are like rot. You can paint over them, you can hide them in the walls, but eventually they start to smell. You can't keep a dead body in the closet for 40 years without it eventually dragging you down. The 3 men probably thought they had beaten the house. They probably thought, we did it, we got away with it, we're gonna die in our beds as free men. They got comfortable, they got sloppy. They forgot that while they were getting older, the world was getting smarter. And they forgot that fear, the fear that bound them to that vow of silence, has a shelf life. Eventually, even the scariest threat loses its teeth. Eventually, the guilt becomes heavier than the fear. They were hidden in plain sight. Yes, but the spotlight was swinging back around, and it was about to catch them right in the eyes. There is a specific smell to a cold case file. It smells like old paper, rusting staples, and failure. When a case sits for 40 years, it becomes a physical artifact of a town's shame. By the mid-2000s, the box containing the John McCabe murder file was buried deep in the archives of the Lowell Police Department. It was a relic. Most of the men who wrote the original reports were dead or long retired. The evidence, the rope, the tape, the clothes, was sitting in storage, degrading with every passing season. To the outside world, the case was dead, but inside the department, and certainly inside the McCabe home, it was just sleeping. Around 2006, things started to change. The Lowell Police, working with the Middlesex District Attorney's Office, decided to take a fresh look at their unsolved murders. They formed a cold case project. This wasn't some high-tech, futuristic operation with glass walls and holograms. It was detectives pulling dusty boxes off shelves and reading through thousands of pages of typed reports, looking for the loose thread that everyone else had missed.
When they opened the McCabe file, they didn't find a smoking gun. They found a mess. They found the drug gang theories that went nowhere. They found the bad tips. But they also found those index cards I told you about earlier. The names of the teenagers who were at the dance. The names of the boys in the maroon Chevy. Michael Ferreira, Walter Shelley, Edward Brown. The detectives looked at the timeline. They looked at the vow of silence that had been whispered about for years but never proven. And they realized that the only way to crack this case wasn't with a microscope, it was with pressure. I want to be clear about something because it goes against everything we've been trained to expect from modern crime stories. We all wait for the DNA moment. We wait for the scientist in the lab coat to hold up a vial and say, "We got him." We want the science to save us because science is objective. Science doesn't lie. But in this case, science couldn't help. The DNA was too old, too degraded, or simply not there. The rope didn't yield the magic profile. The tape was a dead end. If they were going to solve this, they had to do it the old-fashioned way. They had to break a human being. In 2008, the police started shaking the trees. That's police speak for going out and making people nervous. They started knocking on doors that hadn't been knocked on since the Nixon administration. They tracked down the witnesses who are now in their late 50s and early 60s. Imagine being one of those men. You're Edward Brown. You're 59 years old. You're living a quiet life. The murder of John McCabe is a dark, locked room in the back of your mind that you haven't visited in decades. You think you got away with it. You think the world has forgotten. Then, on a random Tuesday, there's a knock at the door. You open it, and there are detectives standing on your porch. They aren't asking about a recent robbery. They're asking about 1969. The blood must have drained out of his face. The detectives played a psychological game. They knew they didn't have the physical evidence to convict. If they just arrested them and went to trial, a good defense lawyer would tear the case apart. Where's the proof? Where's the DNA? This is all ancient history. They needed a confession. They needed one of the three to turn on the others. They looked at the trio. Shelley, the ringleader with the car. Ferreira, the tough guy who made the threats. And Brown. They identified Brown as the weak link. Why Brown? Maybe he seemed the most guilt-ridden. Maybe he had the most to lose. Or maybe he was just the one who wasn't the alpha dog. The police applied the heat. They brought him in. They questioned him. They let him know that the gang theory was dead, and they knew exactly who was in that car. The vow of silence is a powerful thing when you're 18 and terrified of your friend beating you up. But does that vow hold up when you're almost 60? Does it hold up when you're looking at spending the rest of your golden years dying in a concrete cell? The district attorney put a deal on the table. It was a deal that probably tasted like ash in the mouths of the McCabe family, but it was necessary. The offer was this: testify against Walter Shelley and Michael Ferreira. Tell us exactly what happened that night. In exchange, you plead guilty to manslaughter. And here is the kicker: no jail time. Think about the morality of that for a second.
This man participated in the kidnapping and torture of a 15-year-old boy. He helped bind him, he left him to die in the dirt, and the state was offering him a get-out-of-jail-free card. It feels wrong. It feels like cheating, but this is the ugly math of justice. Without Brown, there is no case. Without Brown, Walter Shelley, the man who drove the car and instigated the violence, walks free forever. The prosecutors had to choose between perfect justice, which was impossible, and imperfect justice, which was within reach. They slid the paper across the table to Edward Brown. This was the turning point. This was the moment where 41 years of silence collided with the instinct for self-preservation. Brown had a choice. He could stick to the code, he could keep his mouth shut, protect his high school buddies, and roll the dice at trial. If he won, he walked. If he lost, he died in prison. Or he could sign the paper. He could betray the pact. He could become the rat. But he would sleep in his own bed tonight. Edward Brown picked up the pen. The vow of silence shattered. It didn't break with a bang. It broke with the scratch of a pen on paper. Once he started talking, the dam broke. He didn't just give them a name. He gave them the movie. He filled in the blank pages of the last 40 years. He told them about the car. He told them about the jealousy over the girl. He told them about the rope. He confirmed what the police had suspected but couldn't prove. There was no gang. There were no drug dealers. It was just three idiots who thought they were tough guys, trying to teach a lesson that turned into a murder.
The breakthrough didn't happen in a lab. It happened in an interrogation room, driven by the selfish fear of an aging man. Brown saved his own skin, yes, but in doing so, he finally gave John McCabe's parents the one thing they had been starving for: the truth. The monsters weren't under the bed. They were the men who had been walking around town all along. And now, finally, the police were coming for them. When Edward Brown finally took the witness stand, the courtroom didn't just go quiet. It went still. You could feel the air get heavy. This wasn't just a witness. This was the ghost of 1969 walking into the room. Brown was 59 years old. He looked like a regular guy you'd see at a hardware store. Gray hair, glasses, a little heavy set. He didn't look like a killer. But as he sat there, sworn to tell the truth, he began to dismantle 40 years of lies. He was the only one of the three men who decided to talk. He had taken the plea deal, manslaughter, no jail time, in exchange for giving the jury the one thing they didn't have: the story. For decades, the police had theories. They had the rope, they had the body, but they didn't have the script. They didn't know what was said, who did what, or why. Brown filled in the blanks, and the picture he painted was so ugly, so petty, and so tragic that it made the gangland execution theory look dignified by comparison. The motive wasn't drugs. It wasn't money. It wasn't a mob hit. It was a girl. Brown told the jury that on the night of September 27, 1969, Walter Shelley was angry. Shelley was 18 years old. He was driving his maroon Chevy Impala, the car that gave him his status. He was dating a girl named Marla Shiner. Marla was young, 13 years old, but in Shelley's mind, she was his. Earlier that night, at the Knights of Columbus dance, John McCabe had spoken to Marla. That was his crime. He had messed with her. We don't know if he flirted. We don't know if he just asked her for the time. It doesn't matter. To Walter Shelley, it was an insult. It was a challenge to his territory. Brown described the mood in the car. It was Shelley, Brown,
and Michael Ferreira. They were drinking beer.
They were pumped up on that toxic mix of teenage testosterone and insecurity. They were driving around Tewksbury looking for something to do when they saw him. John was on the side of the road, thumb out, hitchhiking home. I want you to picture the randomness of that. If John had left 5 minutes earlier, he's gone. If Shelley had taken a different turn, he misses him. But the timelines intersected. Brown testified that they pulled over. Now, usually when a car pulls over for a hitchhiker, it's an act of charity. But the vibe here was wrong immediately. They told John to get in. Brown said that almost as soon as John was in the car, the violence started. It wasn't a conversation, it was an abduction. Ferreira, who was sitting in the back, allegedly started slapping John. Imagine the terror of that. You're 15. You think you're getting a ride home from some older guys from town, and suddenly the doors are locked and you're getting hit. The car is moving. You're trapped in a steel box with 3 people who hate you for a reason you don't even understand. Brown said they drove to the vacant lot off Maple Street in Lowell. This wasn't a random spot. It was a place they knew, a place where they could handle their business without being seen. They dragged John out of the car. This is where the testimony became grueling. It's one thing to hear about a fight. It's another to hear the step-by-step mechanics of torture. And make no mistake, what Brown described was torture. They didn't just beat him up and leave him there. They wanted to humiliate him. They wanted to terrify him. Brown detailed the binding. This is the part that had baffled police for 40 years. Why the complex knots? Why the rope from the neck to the ankles? Brown explained that they had the rope in the trunk. They forced John onto his stomach in the dirt. They tied his wrists. They tied his ankles. And then, in a move of pure sadism, they ran the rope from his ankles up to his neck. I need to explain the physics of this because it's the key to the whole case. It's a restraint method that weaponizes the victim's own body. If John lay perfectly still, the rope would be slack. He could breathe. But if he tried to kick, if he tried to straighten his legs to run or fight, the rope would pull tight around his throat. They turned him into a self-strangling machine.
Then came the tape. They taped his mouth shut so he couldn't scream. They taped his eyes shut. I want you to pause on that detail. The eyes. Taping someone's mouth is about silence. Taping someone's eyes is about power. It's about plunging them into absolute darkness. It's about making them feel alone even when you're standing right there. It disorients the brain. It spikes the panic response. John was lying in the dirt, blind, mute, and bound. And then they taunted him. Brown told the courtroom that as they stood over him, one of them, allegedly Shelley or Ferreira, said, "That's for messing with Marla." That was the sentence. That was the reason. A 15-year-old boy was being destroyed because he talked to a girl at a dance? And then they did the most callous thing of all. They got back in the Chevy. They started the engine, and they drove away. They left him there. Brown's testimony brought up a question that the jury had to wrestle with. Did they mean to kill him? Brown claimed they didn't. He tried to sell the idea that this was just a prank that went horribly wrong. He suggested that they thought they were just scaring him. They thought they'd leave him there for a while, he'd struggle, maybe he'd get loose eventually, and he'd learn his lesson. Don't touch my girlfriend. But you have to look at the actions, not the intent. You don't tie a rope around a boy's neck and leave him in a deserted field in the middle of the night if you care about his survival. You are, at the very least, indifferent to whether he lives or dies. The medical examiner's report, which was brought in to back up Brown's story, confirmed the horror of John's final moments. John didn't die instantly. He wasn't shot, he wasn't stabbed, he died of asphyxiation.
The medical examiner explained that John struggled. Of course he struggled. He was 15. He was terrified. He was alone in the dark. His instinct, the biological imperative of every living thing, was to fight. He probably tried to stand up. He probably tried to kick his legs out to crawl away. But every time he fought, the rope did its work. Every time he pushed against the bonds, the noose tightened. It is a heartbreaking realization. John McCabe's own will to live is what killed him. If he had just lain there, perfectly still, waiting for morning, waiting for those two kids to come catch frogs, he might have survived. He might have just been found dehydrated and scared. But he fought, and in fighting, he strangled himself. He died alone, in the dark, in the dirt. Brown's confession sucked the air out of the room because it stripped away the mystery. There was no boogeyman. There was no drug cartel. There was just a jealous teenager with a car and two friends who were too cowardly to say stop. The banality of evil was on full display. It was a stupid high school beef that escalated into a homicide because nobody hit the brakes. Brown described the aftermath too. He talked about the pact. He talked about how Ferreira threatened them. He talked about the fear. If you talk, you're dead. So they went home. They probably washed the dirt off their hands. They went to sleep. And the next day, when the news broke that John was dead, they realized they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. They realized it wasn't a prank anymore. It was murder. Listening to Brown, you could see the timeline of the last 40 years differently. You realized that while John's parents were freezing in time, trapped in their grief, these three men were carrying a secret that must have felt like a cancer. But the jury also had to look at Brown and wonder, is he telling the truth now, or is he just saving his own skin?
He was the rat. In the eyes of the old neighborhood code, he was the traitor. But in the eyes of the law, he was the tool. The defense attorneys for Shelley and Ferreira went after him. They called him a liar. They said he was making it all up to get the plea deal. They pointed out that his memory of 1969 might be fuzzy. They tried to say, there is no physical evidence linking our clients to this. It's just the word of one man who wants to stay out of prison. And they were right, technically. There was no DNA. There were no fingerprints. It was just Brown's word. But the story fit. It fit the knots, it fit the tape, it fit the Chevy sightings, and it fit the psychological profile of a teenage grudge. It rang true in a way that the gang theory never did. It had the messy, stupid, tragic texture of reality. The whodunit wasn't a master plan. It was a series of bad decisions made by boys playing at being tough guys. They picked him up. They beat him. They tied him. They left him. For the McCabe family, sitting in the gallery, this must have been the hardest day of their lives. To know that John suffered, to know that he was taunted, to know that his last thoughts were of fear and darkness. But it was also the day the truth finally won. The fog was gone. They knew exactly how their son died. They knew whose hands tied the knots. The procedural part of the case, the investigation, the interviews, the deal-making, had led to this moment. The mechanism of the crime was laid bare. It wasn't a puzzle anymore. It was just a tragedy caused by three men who thought they owned the world, and a boy who just wanted to get home. The jury listened. They took notes. They looked at Brown, and then they looked at Shelley and Ferreira at the defense table. They were measuring the old men against the teenagers in the story. and they were deciding if 40 years of silence was enough to wash away the guilt of that night in the field. Brown stepped down from the stand. He had done his part. He had betrayed his friends to save himself, but in doing so, he had given justice a fighting chance. The how was answered. Now the only question left was what the jury would do with it.
It's rare that you get to see karma actually cash a check that's been pending for 4 decades. Usually, if a murder isn't solved in the first year, it stays unsolved. The killer drifts away, the file rots, and the universe just accepts the injustice. But in October 2011, the universe decided it had had enough. The police moved in. They didn't kick down doors in a drug den. They didn't storm a hideout. They pulled up to regular houses in regular neighborhoods. The men they arrested weren't the wild, violent teenagers who had stomped John McCabe to death in a field. They were men in their late 50s and early 60s. They were grandfathers. They were the guys you stood behind in line at the grocery store. When the handcuffs clicked onto the wrists of Walter Shelley, Michael Ferreira, and Edward Brown, the shockwave didn't just hit them, it hit the entire town of Tewksbury. You have to understand the psychological whiplash for the community. For 41 years, people had told themselves a story about gangs and outsiders. It was a comforting lie. It meant the danger was out there. But when the police paraded these 3 local men in front of the cameras, the town had to confront a much uglier reality. The danger had been right here. The men who killed the good kid were just neighbors. They had been hiding in plain sight, attending barbecues and paying taxes, living on borrowed time. The legal process that followed was a slow grind, but it led to a moment of absolute clarity in 2013. Walter Shelley stood trial. He was the one who drove the maroon Chevy. He was the one who was jealous of a 15-year-old boy talking to his girlfriend. He was the catalyst. The courtroom was packed. It was a time machine. You had witnesses testifying about a night in 1969, recalling details about a dance and a hitchhiker, while sitting in a modern courtroom with fluorescent lights and computers. It was surreal. But the facts hadn't changed. The rope was still the rope. The motive was still the motive. The jury didn't buy the prank defense. They didn't buy the idea that it was an accident. They looked at the binding, that horrific, calculated knot that tied John's neck to his ankles, and they saw intent. They saw malice.
When the foreman read the verdict, the air left the room. Guilty. First-degree murder. Walter Shelley was sentenced to life in prison. Think about what that means. He was in his 60s. A life sentence at that age isn't about rehabilitation. It's a death sentence. It means you will die in a cage. It means the state is taking the rest of your days to pay for the boy you took in 1969. Shelley had lived a whole life. He got to fall in love. He got to drive cars. He got to see the ocean. He got to eat good food. But the bill had finally come due. He was led away to spend his final years staring at concrete walls, exactly the fate he deserved. But the real story of the aftermath isn't about the killer. It's about the parents. I want you to look at William and Evelyn McCabe. By the time the verdict came down, they were elderly. They were fragile. They had spent more of their lives grieving John than they had raising him. That is a tragedy I can't even wrap my head around. Imagine waking up every single day for 14,000 days, wondering who and why. Most people would have broken. Most people would have let the bitterness eat them alive or just given up when the police stopped calling. But the McCabes didn't. They were made of something stronger. They endured the silence.
They endured the false leads. They endured the sight of their son's killers walking free around town. Standing outside the courthouse in Lowell, surrounded by a crush of reporters and cameras, William McCabe leaned into the microphones. He didn't scream. He didn't cheer. He looked tired. He said, "We are still a little shell-shocked." That phrase, shell-shocked, says it all. It's a term from war. And that's what this was. It was a 40-year war of attrition between a family's love and a trio's silence. The family won, but look at the cost. They lost their son, and then they lost the peace of their adult lives fighting for him. There was no joy in that moment. You can't have joy when the victory comes 40 years late. John was still dead. He wasn't coming back to finish high school. He wasn't coming back to have kids of his own. The verdict didn't fix the past.
But it did something else. It fixed the record. For decades, John McCabe was a question mark. He was a cold case file number. He was the victim in the vacant lot. The trial turned him back into a person. It told the world, officially and legally, that he didn't die because of a drug deal. He didn't die because he was a bad kid. He died because he was innocent, and he was killed by people who were jealous of that light. The vow of silence was supposed to protect the killers forever. It failed. The gang theory was supposed to distract the police forever. It failed. The only thing that lasted, the only thing that was stronger than the lies and the time and the rot, was the persistence of two parents who refused to let their son be forgotten. Justice is a messy, imperfect thing. It often comes too late. It often feels hollow. But on that day in 2013, when the gavel banged down, it meant something. It meant that you can't outrun the truth. You can hide it for a year, or 10 years, or 41 years. You can grow old. You can change your hair color. You can move on. But the truth is patient. It waits in the dirt. It waits in the memory of a friend. It waits in the conscience of a co-conspirator. The chalk outline of John McCabe washed away in the rain back in 1969. The weeds grew back over the spot where he died. But the story is no longer buried in that lot. We know who did it. We know why. And we know that even in the longest, coldest night, the sun eventually has to come up.